By the end of this story, Sofia would be known as Roberto's adopted daughter. That outcome only came after the truth in a small silver cross finally broke a silence that had lasted decades. A thin, dirt-streaked hand closed around the pendant, as if it could keep the world from slipping away. The silver cross was no bigger than a thumbprint, its edges smoothed by years of being touched and tucked away into hems and pockets. It caught the light from the chandelier for a single deliberate flash before Sofia lifted it, held it out across the marble, and said plainly, "This was my late mother's necklace." The words seemed to rearrange the room. The echoes finished their slow fall and someone coughed, embarrassed by sound. A portrait behind the reception desk watched over them, an oil painting in a heavy frame, an older man in a dark suit. The same face, but with years of softness missing, the sort of absence you see in photographs of men who have learned to keep their hands clean of the messy parts of life. Roberto Alves felt it first in his fingers. They trembled. Sofia had walked up the mansion's broad stone steps, carrying a plastic bag of small things to sell, buttons, cheap chains, a handful of costume jewelry. She had not expected the stretching silence that met her when the gate opened, nor the polished hush inside that swallowed street noise like a mouth. She had come because her mother's breathing had been worse that week, and her pockets were emptier than the waiting room at the clinic. The necklace was all she had left that belonged plainly to Amelia. It was the neatest, the most legible trace of a woman who sewed night into day and stitched children into clothes she couldn't afford. People in the hall froze because the pendant was the kind of object that carries a life with it. Objects don't speak, but they press memory on people like a finger to a bruise. For Roberto, the cross put a shape on a memory he had spent years trying to file where no one could find it. The reek of diesel and fried onions clung to Sofia's jacket. The mansion smelled of wax and wood polish and lemon, an absence of the things that mark a neighborhood where one cough can mean catastrophe. On the marble table close to where she stood, there was a stack of envelopes, a silver bell, a small dish of mints that no one took. Teresa, the secretary, looked like someone who had learned patience as a profession. She blinked, then straightened, fingers folding into one another. Roberto rose from his chair with the kind of slow motion people confuse for dignity. He had taught himself to keep his face small, to make sure that his hands betrayed nothing. Now his hands moved like a man who had been told the script of his life had a forgotten page. "How long?" he asked. But it was not clear whether he addressed Sofia or the pendant. "Since before I can remember," Sofia said. "She used to tuck it under my shirt when I sold things. When she coughed, she held it like it kept her whole." Silence. The hush in the room grew teeth. "May I see it?" Roberto asked. Sofia hesitated. The necklace was light in her palm, but it weighed more than the sum of its silver. She turned it over, and a faint engraving showed where letters had been rubbed, nearly smooth by years of worry. An R here, maybe an A, perhaps a line where a date once lived. She handed it to him. For a long breath, Roberto stared at the cross. The portrait on the wall looked like a judge more than a man. The house felt suddenly too big for the small thing between his fingers. "Amelia," he said, the name coming out like a half apology. You could hear decades in that syllable. "A private admission, but the mansion is a place where privacy is arranged like furniture, perfectly, and sometimes cruelly." Teresa took a cautious step and announced softly, "Mr. Alves, there's a photograph in the study. A young woman. It's been in the back, among the ledgers. No one expected a connection. No one wanted the trouble of one. But the photograph slid a key into a lock. Sofia had never seen Amelia look at a mirror with leisure. When she had been small, Amelia would press a coin into Sofia's palm and send her out with a list. Bread, a little milk, and the courage to stand steady wherever the day would demand it. Nights were measured by how many stitches could be taken before Amelia's shoulders trembled with fatigue. There had been a doctor's diagnosis, something about lungs and time, but a diagnosis doesn't fix the life you must live to pay for the medicine. The mattress sagged where bills folded into it. The tap in the kitchen hummed a constant, exhausted note. Against that sound, a tiny silver cross had been a witness. Paula, the schoolteacher from the block, and Lucas, a friend of Sofia's who had a way of moving, as if the world could be persuaded by speed, had argued quietly, urgently, that she go to the mansion. "They have charity lists," Paula said. "And sometimes people with enough money still remember how to be small," Lucas added. When Sofia reached the hall, she did not know which course of small mercy she expected. Minute interventions, some pills, perhaps a small envelope of cash. She did not imagine this room, the portrait, the man whose name circulated at the top of newspapers, for generosity and for boards of trustees. She certainly did not imagine the word her mouth would learn that day. Accusation. "Who is Amelia?" Roberto asked after a silence that tasted of old protocol. "She was my mother," Sofia said. "She died last month. Her voice hardened. She worked. She made things to sell. She never complained in a way that made it other people's problem. This is what she left." He held the cross between his fingers as if it burned. The engraved letters didn't give up their secret, but the pendant had already done its work. It had made a history into a thing with edges. He turned to Teresa, who, for all her cultivated detachment, could read when a house needed to tilt toward truth or away from it. She found a drawer, a folder, a desk that remembered details people preferred to tuck away. The first artifact was not scandalous. It was ordinary. A photograph in black and white of a young woman with a resolute jaw and a ribbon in her hair. She was smiling at someone off camera, the way people smile at the promise of a life changing. On the back was a date and a hastily written name, Amelia, and a number that might have been an address. Roberto started, then stopped. He looked as if memory had turned into a foreign language. He fingered the corner of the photograph as if it were a map of old roads he'd walked once and avoided ever since. There were small things too, a receipt folded in a ledger for jewelry bought years earlier, the dust-stained edge of an envelope with a name in the same looping hand that Sofia recognized from other notes tucked into a seam. The house held these small ghosts, like people hide photographs under loose floorboards. Each artifact tightened the narrative until it hummed. "This photo, where did it come from?" Sofia asked. The voice that had sold trinkets in the noon heat carried no expectation of courtesy. It had the kind of plainness poverty teaches, truth as currency. "It was part of an estate box," Teresa said. "We found it a while ago and didn't know what to do with it." Roberto's jaw worked. He had been a man who learned to keep parts of his life safe for the family that came after him. He had made decisions, marriages, business associations, alliances that had kept his public life clean. Sometimes the decisions that preserve surfaces cost the people who cannot pay for self-protection. "I knew an Amelia once," Roberto said, not as confession but as an acknowledgement of a landscape, a long time ago. "We weren't married. There were promises nobody wanted to keep. I thought—" He paused, and the pause was full of all the ways a person hopes not to be called to account. "I thought I protected her." Sofia listened. The story he offered was not a tale of villains and heroes. It was a ledger of choices and omissions. He explained, stubborn, halting, like a man learning to speak a language he had avoided, how a friendship had become something intimating, how family pressure had circled like a guard, how a promise had been shelved in the name of reputation. He didn't use words like shame, but his reticence named it. Paula and Lucas stood near the doorway, faces set in lines that had learned to expect injustice. Paula's hands found Sofia's without anyone asking. A teacher's reflex. Protect the fragile place where truth meets consequence. Lucas's jaw flexed. He had always been the one who moved when things needed to change. To him, the photograph was a call to action. To Paula, it was a lesson in taking the long view. The problem was that artifacts make allegations plausible, not definitive. A photograph points to presence. A receipt points to a purchase. A name on a page suggests a connection. None of them, on their own, could prove paternity or relationship. For that, they needed two things that belonged to a later era: a trace of biology and a technician with a microscope machine. Teresa, who had kept the house running under the weight of quiet compromises, moved with sudden efficiency after that. Old files located, a desk drawer opened to reveal a baptismal record kept in a small parish book. An entry read like a map with no compass, a date, a child's name, a godparent's signature. The handwriting was the kind that had been taught to be neat for church and registry officers, legible and official. It connected a place, a time, and a set of names that made the timeline hungrier for proof. Roberto suggested tests. He was at once resolved and tentative, ready to confirm what the paper trail suggested, but fearful of what the confirmation would mean. A confirmed relation had consequences, legal, financial, and, more importantly, moral. The house had been organized to keep obligations at bay. Now it faced one it could not simply pay away. "You understand, we do this properly," Dr. Henrique said when he arrived, the physician who knew both the language of science and the cadences of human embarrassment. He spoke in clear, small sentences, so the process would not sound like a magic trick. "We take two simple samples, cheek swabs, nothing invasive. We look at genetic markers, which are short sequences of DNA that vary from person to person. A close relationship will show a shared pattern. If the samples match in a high number of those markers, we can say, with great confidence, there is a biological link." Sofia's palms were warm and slightly damp. She watched Dr. Henrique work with the calm that comes from someone trained to find the human in a test tube. The girls in the neighborhood had told her many things about modern tests, rumors simplified into certainty. Dr. Henrique did what science requires. He named complexity and squeezed it down to understandable facts. "A match doesn't absolve anyone of what they did or didn't do in the past," he said. "It does, however, tell us what the biology is. That's just one part of the story." There was a montage of days then. The cartorio, with its clerk who smelled of paper and coffee, the slow scratching of pens on official pages, as Paula and Teresa unearthed ledgers and receipts that attached names to the photograph. Neighbors in Sofia's building watched the scene on television like everyone else. A man known for philanthropy, standing under the weight of a private past. Social media murmured briefly, then quieted. The story felt too intimate for the gaveling voice of online opinion, and the family wanted it that way. At the lab, the procedure was simple and sacred in a small procedural way. A cotton swab rubbed the inside of each cheek, then sealed in sterile plastic. The samples went into labeled envelopes, small, blameless things. A technician, patient and bureaucratic, explained the timeline. A few days, maybe a week. People in the mansion shifted, waiting with a strange kind of vigilance that is equal parts remorse and fear. Sofia went back to the block. The rooms where she and Amelia had lived seemed smaller for the absence of weight that one person carries. The bed creaked the way it always had. The neighbor Rosa brought over soup, like a tangible prayer. Lucas and Paula kept up with lists, medicines, food deliveries, anyone who could be called on for the next step. The community formed itself like a bandage. They were, in small ways, experts at mending harm. In the house, Roberto tried to act like himself and failed. His hands betrayed him in small tremors when the mail came. A simple envelope would cause an internal recalibration. The past had a way of arriving in the present with a patience that outlived the people who tried to keep it buried. He walked to the study and stood for a long time with the photograph in his palm, as if time could be smoothed by touch. There was a day when Sofia visited again. Because hope is a workmanlike thing, and also a gamble. Amelia's breath had been harsh the week before, and the doctor had said more than once that steady care could make a difference even when it couldn't promise cure. The medicines that costed more than a month's wages for Sofia had become the measure of what the truth might bring. She kept a list in a small pocket notebook, a list that had a hole near the corner where rain had soaked it once and made the ink swim. When the lab called, Teresa took the call. Her face arranged itself into careful neutrality, then slackened like someone hearing a verdict. Roberto gathered himself. He walked out into the light of the conservatory where plants had been chosen for their ornamental steadiness. He held the cross in one hand, as if it were a compass. He said nothing at first. "We have a high probability match," the technician said, using the language of the lab that comes like glass between people. "The markers we analyzed show a strong biological relationship consistent with a parent-child link." The words are simple but seismic. The mansion seemed to tilt. For a moment, nothing else existed but the cross and the way the light refracted on it and on the faces in the room. Roberto's knees buckled, and he sat down hard, as if his bones wanted him to understand the weight of history. He covered his face with his hands and began to weep. He made sounds people rarely hear in public, sounds that mean remorse and regret, and an admission that silence had been its own choice. He trembled in the way the title had promised. Sofia watched him. The face she saw was not an enemy's. It was a man who had lived inside a different set of rules. He had been powerful enough to keep his past secret. He had been cautious enough to protect the life he had built. The revelation did not make him a monster in the way tabloids might want. It made him a man who had to reckon with the cost of what secrecy takes from the ones left visible in the aftermath. "Then you know," he said, voice raw. "You know how long I have been carrying this in my pocket. I thought—" He started and stopped. "You thought better of it?" Sofia asked. But she did not spit accusation. Her voice carried fatigue more than fury. She had lived on an economy where words like forgiveness are expensive luxuries. She understood that the question of intention mattered. But what her mother had needed was not a cleaned conscience. She had needed care. Action followed, but it was not instant absolution. Roberto did what he could at once. He did what belonged to the immediate human obligation. Phone calls that had the texture of admission, checks written, arrangements for home deliveries of Amelia's medicine. There was a small ceremony of practical care in which Teresa took an inventory of needs and Paula organized a schedule for daily help. The house, which had been a testament to control, let go of some of that control to care. "I can pay for the best treatment," Roberto said. "I can make sure she has someone with her." His words were not promises of magic. They were logistics, and that is the language the sick need: steady, practical help. "And I will do more. I will not pretend this is only a private thing. It is my responsibility." Nobody in the neighborhood wanted grand gestures. They wanted reliable medicine, regular checkups. The stability that comes from knowing bills will not go unpaid. Roberto's commitment was generous, and he created an endowment for the block's clinic. Money earmarked for medication, for a visiting nurse, for small repairs to the building's plumbing that meant more than you might think to people who cannot afford a leaky roof. He agreed to fund a small program at the school where Paula taught, for tutoring and scholarship aid. It was the kind of reparative act that mends in practical stitches rather than dramaturgy. But the emotional cost could not be bought away. Amelia had not been consulted. She had been a presence that belonged to a life of quiet endurance. She had been alive to the world of mistakes, and her trust could not be traded for money. The family's attempt to reconcile had to begin with listening. They began to visit. Roberto sat for hours in a white-walled room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and lemon cleaner while Amelia slept, her breath punctuating the air. He would read aloud sometimes from newspapers, sometimes from children's stories when Amelia's eyes opened and invited the world in. Words like apology and regret were awkward in the antiseptic light. He learned to use them anyway. He learned to carry the small tasks he had never made room for, bringing a cup of tea at the right temperature, learning the right brand of medicine, showing up for the things that make vulnerability less lonely. Sofia watched these efforts with a wary hope. She had learned the difference between a check written for optics and a hand that stayed to fold laundry. Lucas took to visiting with a pragmatic steadiness that amused even Paula. He would climb the steps to the mansion with a grocery bag and a smile, as if to prove that alliance is not only paper deep. He and Paula arranged a rota of neighbors and helpers so that Amelia would never be alone at night, and so that Sofia could sleep on the nights her tremors of fear would otherwise wake her. Then there were the legal things, paperwork that would give Sofia an identity beyond the street. Roberto's lawyers moved carefully. This was delicate territory with an audience ready to misread every gesture. Roberto wanted to formalize care without spectacle, to make a way for Sofia that required no whispers later. Adoption, they decided, would be the clearest legal framework in which responsibility and rights were balanced. It would not erase the past, nor would it compensate for years of absence, but it would give Sofia protections and a name on papers that could be used to secure things for the future: education, health insurance, stability. Sofia considered it. Adoption, for her, was not a fairy tale. It was a legal instrument that could change the calculations of her life. It would mean visits to a registrar, interviews, forms, questions that sometimes feel like a second examination of worth. It would mean styles of belonging that had been absent. Sofia agreed. Her agreement was not a forgiveness offered lightly. It was a choice to step into possibility with a cautious trust. The neighborhood noticed. People saw a man at a clinic door wheeling food over to an old woman. They saw him paying for medicines that had previously been beyond the reach of a woman who used to stitch night into day to pay for them. They watched a legal process unroll in the quiet way courts do, papers stamped, hands signed, the steady click of bureaucratic validation. Months passed. The house that had once been a place of quiet, impenetrable order learned to hum differently. Amelia started to breathe easier with regular care, though the illness did not simply go away. The measures they took improved her quality of life in ways that counted every day. Her room was repainted, and a new mattress was bought so that breath did not fight gravity as it had before. A nurse visited twice a week. A small group of volunteers from the program, funded by Roberto's donation, came with warm hands and a practice of sitting in long, patient company. There were dinners where conversations stumbled and then found footing. The first time the three of them ate together in Roberto's dining room, there was a quiet ceremony to it. Plates that used to be polished for effect now held food to nourish those who needed sustenance. Sofia found that the man's laugh, when it came, was small and sometimes abrupt, like someone who has been taught not to waste laughter. Roberto, for his part, learned to accept discretion as part of reparation, the kind of humility that does not demand a spot in the news. The necklace was put in a small case one afternoon, away from the glare of marble and chandeliers, wrapped in felt and tissue, as if it were a relic to be cared for, because relics are truly things people touch when they want to find out what remains. They returned it to Amelia in a quiet moment that was not filmed or announced. She took it between her fingers and smiled with a shock of recognition that told of a memory not yet dulled by time. "This belonged to you?" Roberto asked, watching her. Amelia touched the tiny cross to her chest. "Yes," she said. "I sewed it into a hem when the children were small. It reminded me not to forget them." Small formalities followed. Sofia began school again, supported by the scholarship program. She learned that a classroom can make a person feel lighter in ways that a mattress cannot. The local clinic had a fund now for emergency medicines. No more nights like the ones where coins were counted at the base of a lamp. Lucas invested his energy in a community center project that provided after-school tutoring and a place for mothers to learn skills that paid more than pennies. It was, mostly, the slow bookkeeping of care. The emotional mending was uneven. Some afternoons cast long shadow lines across conversations. There would be moments when Sofia would look at Roberto and see only what had been withheld. There were afternoons when Roberto would stand by the window and stare at the street where his car rarely went, and think about the cost of silence. The neighbors were not quick to erase the past. They were those who watch and ask, and only slowly allow a trust to reform. Trust in that neighborhood is not a currency that can be gifted. It is earned by consistent acts over time. Therapy sessions were arranged for Sofia and Amelia to speak with a counselor who had been recommended by the program Roberto funded. Those sessions were not dramatic, they were patient. A person with a trained ear, asking questions that did not demand immediate forgiveness, but encouraged the telling of things that had been held small. Sofia spoke sometimes in abrupt clauses. Amelia told stories of a childhood stitched together with other women's songs. Roberto listened, and sometimes he spoke, and his words carried the awkwardness of a man coming late to confession. There were quiet surprises. A neighbor who had once refused a handout came back to help with small repairs at the block's building, after Roberto insisted the funds be administered by local committees. A child from the program learned a trade, and after a year had saved enough to buy small tools to start work. The neighborhood's clinic added a nurse's post with part of the endowment. The program paid for bus passes so children could attend after-school tutoring without walking miles in heavy shoes. The community did not transform into some melodramatic utopia. There were resentments small and sharp, people who thought Roberto had been too slow or not public enough, or people who doubted the sincerity of any man who had lived a life of privilege. There were also those who saw a man rearrange his life to become responsible in a concrete way, and adjusted their skepticism into watchful curiosity. Sofia's legal adoption had its paperwork and its photographs. Nothing about it was cinematic except in the smallness of human gestures. The registrar's stamp, the signature of Teresa, who had become a quiet anchor in the bridge between households, the smiles that were careful and not yet easy. When Sofia stood in the registrar's office to sign, she felt diminished and enlarged at once. Adoption changed her legal name and gave her rights she had never had, but what it changed more subtly was the arithmetic of a life. She would no longer be a child whose health depended on chance. Her admission into Roberto's legal household allowed her to plan. At the small celebration afterward, when neighbors came with trays of food and the mood less formal, Roberto quietly apologized. He did not promise an erasure of time. He did not offer the kind of absolution that would be air and nothing else. He acknowledged absence. He pledged continued care. He named the necklace again, not as a trophy, but as a sign, an object small enough to fit in a pocket, yet large enough to shift a life. "This was my late mother's necklace," Sofia reminded the room, holding the cross. Her voice held no triumph. It had the resigned clarity of someone who had learned to measure gratitude carefully. It is not enough to fix everything, but it made us face what was unspoken. "He trembled," someone said, Teresa later, retelling the moment with the careful tenderness of someone who had watched a man's bones rearrange. There was truth in it. Roberto trembled because his comfort was unsettled, not simply because his attention had been forced. The tremor was the body's honest response to being called into account. Months later, there were quieter moments that meant more than any announcement. Sandra, a neighbor, found new relief when the clinic paid for a month's worth of her mother's medication. Paula sat in the newly funded tutoring room and watched as a boy who'd been set adrift by his family's debts finally learned fractions. Lucas stood by a mural painted on the community center wall, painted by children and financed by a trust Roberto had set up. and felt a small pride that was not his alone. Repair, in the story they were writing, was not linear. It bent back on itself, relearned, reconfigured. There were days when Roberto still avoided the portrait for fear of how the eyes looked back. There were days when Sofia wanted nothing to do with the mansion's hush and preferred the neighborhood's clatter. But there were also dinners where laughter was not edged with an awareness of past absences. There were nights when Amelia fell asleep with the cross under her shirt and woke without the cough that had once tethered her to terror. People in the block sometimes asked if the man who had kept memory at bay had become a different person. The answer was complicated. He became a man who had to face a history that required labor, not only of funds, but of presence. He learned to accept discomfort. He discovered that restitution is a long list of small acts: showing up, being accountable, ensuring access to medicine, creating opportunities for children, and importantly, listening when those who had been silenced chose to speak. Years later, the necklace rested in a box lined in felt on a small shelf in Amelia's room. The felt had smoothed into the shape of the cross. It was a simple cradle for the small metal object that had opened so many doors. When someone asked Sofia what the pendant meant to her now, she touched the felt as if it were a map. "It's a reminder," she said, "of what was taken for granted and what we had to call back. It is not a talisman that makes things easy. It's a truth that, once out, asks for repair." The repair had not fixed every fracture. It had, however, brought a set of practical changes that made the day-to-day less precarious. Amelia's medicine never failed to arrive. The clinic had a nurse on nights when breathing grew thin, funded by a modest but steady endowment. The children of the neighborhood had a place to do homework without the hum of a busy kitchen swallowing concentration. Those were the measurable things that mattered. Sometime later, in a small ceremony attended by friends and neighbors, Sofia signed the paperwork that made her Roberto's legal daughter. It was a quiet moment with no fanfare, no press, no headline. The title the world might give her later, "The Billionaire's Adopted Daughter," was accurate, but only if one understood that the title came as consequence of a long and difficult truth. The headline the world liked was shorthand. The reality was a braided rope of admission, care, paperwork, therapy, and community rebuilding. In the years that followed, Roberto would sometimes stand beside the community center and listen to the noise of children playing, and he would think of the cross. He would remember the day his fingers trembled and how small things press on big lives. He would recognize that power without tenderness leaves wounds open. He would learn slowly that making amends is not a single act, but a practice. Sofia kept the cross under her pillow for a while, then put it away into the box on the shelf. It was not about hoarding the relic of a painful past. It was about storing an object that told them where they had all been. She met with other young people who had come through the program and told them plainly that your life can change, but only if you are willing to do the hard work of letting others hold you and choosing whom you will trust. Once, when a friend asked what she had learned from the whole affair, Sofia answered in a way that surprised even her. "That small things tell the truth," she said. "That responsibility can't be stored in a bank the way money can. People who do harm sometimes also can choose to help. You have to watch their actions longer than their words." People nodded. It was not an elegant moral, it was an inventory of the pragmatic. The silver cross remained a quiet object in a box. It had done its work. It had moved a truth out of silence and into the light. The house where Roberto lived had stopped being a place that kept the past under glass and had become, imperfectly, a place that answered when a person called for help. The neighborhood had not been saved by a single act. It had been assisted by the steady, sometimes awkward work of responsibility. In the end, the necklace was both symbol and trigger. It was a small, ordinary thing whose provenance could not by itself fix the past. But it had compelled people to pay attention. It had forced a man into the uncomfortable labor of confession and action. It had given a woman medical care enough to breathe easier and a child enough stability to begin school. It had reminded a community that truth can be painful but necessary, and that repair is a long process of measured actions. When the story was told in the block and in the house, people would repeat the line with a small, reverent pause. "This was my late mother's necklace." They would add with a softer voice, "He trembled." The tremble was not a spectacle. It was a sign that someone's past had been called into the room and could no longer be put away. If you have a story where a small truth changed everything, write it down in the comments. One line will do. It might help someone understand that small objects sometimes hold the power to open locked doors, and that the work on the other side of those doors is patient, imperfect, and necessary.